All right, I'm going to get started here, and hopefully whoever is on Zoom can see my slides in some form or another.
I'm just gonna like a little two-liner about yourself.
That's fine. I'll hand these out.
Oh, great. Okay. So we have here today at the ACR, the Association for Conflict Resolution event, we have Jill Tanz, who will be speaking to us on neuroscience and mediation. She's been a commercial mediator, having done over 500 cases in real estate, condominium, partnership, probate, and contract disputes. She's a member of the American Arbitration Association's roster of mediators and the National Academy of Distinguished Neutrals. Also a certified mediator with the Cook County Circuit Courts of Law, Chancery, and Probate Divisions. She's lectured extensively on mediation and neuroscience and incorporates best practices developed from this expertise into her mediations. So we're very lucky to have you, and thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Here, this is for you.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, welcome. I'm not exactly sure what's happening, but hopefully everyone in the room can hear me, and hopefully there are other people who can hear me as well. Thank you for the very nice introduction. I realized I need to update it. But anyway, that's fine. It's wonderful to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to share my work. Some of you may have heard me speak about mediation and neuroscience before. The talk I'm going to give today is kind of a culmination of all the work I've done up till now. So why am I interested in neuroscience? Well, about 9 years ago, I took an online course on mediation and neuroscience, and I found it to be completely useless. And I thought, gee, neuroscience should be able to help mediators in some way. And it just so happens that my best friend is an internationally renowned neuroscientist. That would be Professor Martha McClintock. And Martha has spent 50 years doing interdisciplinary studies in psychology, neuroscience, endocrinology, and human development. And so I taught Martha everything I knew about mediation. I learned about this much of what she knows about neuroscience, and we collaborated for over a year before we gave our first presentation. We've been collaborating and coming up with new ideas ever since. And this talk is kind of a culmination of that work and a very practical way to look at what mediation can do to help mediators, particularly with respect to the physiologic stress response. So I will go through my talk, but first I have a little pretest. I'm going to ask you 4 true-false questions, and we'll ask them again at the end and see if I changed any minds. So, do you think that you should start your mediation and join session? True or false? Green is true, red is false. Okay, so wait, hold them up so I can see. Okay, so we have most of you have heard me, I guess. All right. How about true or false? You can reduce high emotions by naming them. True or false? You can reduce high emotions by naming them. Okay, so you mostly think that's true. Venting anger helps in mediation. Okay, about 50-50. Journaling can be useful in mediation. Oh, a wise group, a wise group. Most of you think that's true. All right, so we'll come back to this at the very end. What I want to do is ask 4 questions and answer them. What is the physiologic stress response? What are typical stressors or stress triggers in conflict situations? how do high levels of cortisol associated with the stress response interfere with mediation? And most importantly, and what we'll spend the majority of our time on, what can mediators do to minimize the impact of the stress response? So let's talk for a moment about what the physiologic stress response is about. And to those of you who have heard me speak before, will look familiar. It is mediated by a number of stress hormones that have an impact throughout the mind and body. And so when these hormones are triggered, your breathing rate increases, your heart rate increases, you stop digesting food, you focus better, all of these different things happen. Okay. The two hormones that we're going to be concerned with are adrenaline and cortisol. And, well, that's unfortunate. That was about a third of the slide. So can you see that slide? Okay, so what we see on this slide, it's very complicated, but I'll walk you through it and I think it'll make some sense. On the right-hand side is adrenaline, which is the fast response. Both of these responses start in the brain. So the brain is activated, sees some kind of trigger, and in the hypothalamus, there is a nerve that is connected directly down to the adrenal glands above the kidneys. And that nerve impulse lets the adrenal gland know it should release the epinephrine and norepinephrine, the adrenaline hormones, into the bloodstream. And so through that neural pathway, there's a trigger, it is released, it goes through, impacts various organs, feedback back to the brain that says, oh, there's enough, we don't need any more. So that's the fast response. The slow response on the left side of the slide is the cortisol response. And it also starts in the brain, in the pituitary. But instead of being initiated through a nerve pathway, it is initiated through a specialized circulatory pathway. So there is a vein that goes from the pituitary down to the adrenal gland. The pituitary releases a chemical that when it gets through that circulatory system down to the adrenals, it kicks off the production of the glucocorticoids that go into the bloodstream. So whereas with the fast response in adrenaline, you're going through nerves at the speed of light, in the cortisol, you're going through a circulatory system and it takes longer. And like with adrenaline, with the cortisol, the glucocorticoids are released into the bloodstream, they impact various organs and they feed back to the brain. So let me see if I can get back to the slideshow.
They're both reacting to the same thing at the same time.
I'm not 100% certain. Like I said, I only know this much of the neuroscience. I think they are both triggered by the same things. Certainly, to a large extent they are. I don't know if on the edges it's different. Okay. Sorry about this. So let's look more closely at the adrenaline response, this fast response. This graph shows what happens when subjects are given a task, in this case, asked to present a speech. And the horizontal axis presents the time in minutes. The vertical axis is the amount of hormone measured in the body. And what happens is that starting as soon as the subject is told they're going to give a speech, the adrenaline goes up, the speech is over, it peaks, and immediately it comes down. Takes about 20 minutes for most of it to clear. In contrast, the slower response of cortisol, Here, the subjects are told that they're going to give this speech about 20 minutes in advance, and the cortisol level starts to go up. They give the speech, it continues to go up. They finish the speech, it continues to go up. So there's a lag. It continues to be produced after the stress trigger is no longer in place. And you can see that the length of time along the bottom is much longer. So it takes over an hour for you to get back to baseline. Now, there are two different graphs here because different people react to stressors differently. And depending on what your resources are and how your experience is, you may have a stronger or a less strong response. But what this fast and slow response means is that if you are subject to repeated stressors, the adrenaline will go up and down and up and down. But the cortisol will never have a chance to clear. And if you have a stressor and then a few minutes later another one and then another one, it will go up and up and up. And this is what happens in a situation of chronic stress, where you're under these kind of stressors continuously and the cortisol level keeps increasing. And that creates a problem. Boy, none of my slides are coming through. This is really weird. I'm sorry. I can't skip this one because it's a picture my son took. He's an underwater photographer. This is a fish because the physiologic stress response originated in fish over 600 million years ago, and it is present today in all mammals, many animals in addition to mammals. And it's there in connection with a fight or flight response. So when you are under threat or an animal is under threat, like these longhorn sheep, they have to decide what they want to do. Do they want to fight? Or like this baboon, do they want to flee? In fact, there are other responses to freezing, tend, and befriend, but we'll just stick with the basics for today. So all of these changes in the body were designed to help animals and people respond to this threat, make a quick decision on what to do, have the physical resources to either stand and fight or flee. So what triggers the stress response? Well, classically we think about the physical stress, the physical threats. The saber-toothed tiger, right? You see the saber-toothed tiger and you gotta know that you gotta flee, right? And you gotta run fast to escape the saber-toothed tiger. It's still present today. We're about to cross the street. We take a step, we look, there's a bus bearing down on us, and we need all those extra energy to hop back up on that curb and not get hit by the bus. But it not only is triggered by these physical stressors, it is also triggered by emotional stressors, by social threats. So one of those is giving a speech, which we saw that they use as a way of creating stress to measure the hormone. But other things also will create this response. Being in an unfamiliar setting, feeling subordinated to other people, or fearing a loss of status, having strong emotions, especially strong negative emotions, or feeling disrespected. All of these things will trigger the stress response. So in the mediation situation, we have many triggers, particularly at the start of a mediation. People come in feeling unprepared, feeling less competent than their more experienced adversary, perhaps. People come in and they're unfamiliar with the mediator. They're unfamiliar with the room. They're unfamiliar with the process. All of these things will trigger the stress response. having higher emotions because you are fearful of the situation, fearful of having to confront your adversary, fear of needing to compromise perhaps, or to be creative and come up with solutions. All of these things will trigger the stress response. So lots of things trigger that response in a mediation. Why is it a problem? What is the impact of the stress response? Well, I like this slide because it shows the bell-shaped curve of what happens as cortisol increases. So along the bottom, we're going from low stress, low levels of cortisol, to high stress, very high levels of cortisol. And as it starts to build up, we're in the situation on the green of eustress, where the stress hormones are useful. They're helping us focus on the task at hand. They're helping marshal resources to use in order to deal with the problem. And along the vertical axis is performance, both physical and mental. And so in this eustress portion, as the stress hormones go up, our performance also goes up. The problem is when it tips over the top. When you get past that sweet spot at the top, you get into distress, where the additional hormones are making your performance deteriorate until it gets so high that you really get to the point of non-functional. So here are a series of pictures based on studies by Ekman, who looked at emotions and faces. And this is a face showing anger. And it's been manipulated so that it shows degrees of anger. And it turns out if you train people, they can distinguish a 2 from a 4 or a 3 from a 5. People can learn which is which. But if you put them under stress, raise their cortisol level, and you show them number 3, they'll say it's a number 6. So in the presence of high levels of cortisol, we perceive more anger than is actually present. And as you can imagine, that's not a good thing in mediation. You don't want your parties to think that the other side is angrier than they really are. Are the slides okay this way? Should I keep on this view? Okay. So this is a really cool study by Tomova. And what it's about is perspective taking. And so the subject, and of course we know that subjects in these kinds of studies are always college students, right? The college student and subject is looking at this little box with these little different smaller boxes. And the subject can see 3 different candles, as well as an apple and a truck and all of that. But you notice that some of the boxes have a black back. And that means that the person on the other side, in this case called the director, can't see into those boxes. And the director tells the subject, move the small candle next to the truck. Now, to take the other person's perspective, you have to realize that the tiny candle, the smallest candle, is not visible to the director. You have to realize you have to take the medium-sized candle and move that next to the truck. And so what they actually did is they measured eye movements and how long it took people to look at the proper candle. When they did that, the yellow bars represent the control situation, no stress. And we see that men are significantly faster at this than women are. But when we put people under stress, we see that men's ability to see from the other's perspective deteriorates significantly. Women's performance actually increases a little bit under stress. So there's a gender difference here. But at least for men, the higher the cortisol, the less likely they are to be able to quickly see things from the other's point of view. Now, this is a very effective way to get rid of long-term memory. Stress is not this effective, but stress does have an impact on memory. it's a very nuanced response, and there are many variables that affect what the impact is. It depends, for instance, on what is triggering the stress, whether it's anger or fear or physical threat. It varies by gender, as we saw this last one did. It varies depending on what we're asking people to remember, whether it is angry faces or fearful faces, for instance. And sometimes memory is better for the main event. Sometimes the memories set down are better for the peripheral events. So all kinds of differences. But in short, memory is impaired by higher stress levels. So the impact of stress is to, at some point, decrease our overall performance, to increase our perception of anger, decrease, at least in the case of men, their ability to see from another's perspective, and there's an impact on memory. Okay, so we know what the response is, what triggers it, why it's not good for mediation. What can we do to minimize the impact of stress? So I'm going to spend the rest of the talk going through 7 different strategies that you can use, all pretty simple and straightforward, in order to reduce stress. And I'm going to go over some studies with you explaining why these things work. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what I call early caucus. In a traditional facilitative mediation, we start in joint session, we may separate into caucus, and then we come back perhaps into joint session at the end. My change here is to add what I call an early caucus prior to the joint session. This is not some totally unique kind of idea. Lots of mediators use it for one reason or another. But I was fortunate to be able to, well, before I get there, what do I mean by early caucus? I mean a very short interview with each side, 5 to 10 minutes, an opportunity to build rapport, to answer process questions, very important, to acknowledge stress, acknowledge emotion, to give the parties a better sense of control, and to be able to meet the parties where they are, find out what their emotional temperature is right before you're going to bring them into joint session. Now, I was able to do a study over at CCR, which tested whether this early caucus was really effective. And so CCR had a very strict model where you always started in joint session. Not entirely true, but mostly it's true. And what we did is added an early caucus component to the model. We did 33 sessions. This is the long form model at CCR where the parties come in and you got several hours. And we asked both the mediator and the party to fill out an evaluation after we did the mediation with the early caucus. And we also were able to compare the evaluations that CCR normally gives out in mediations. We were able to go back and pick up 47 earlier cases done by the same mediator, by the same group of mediators, to see whether there was any change in the attributes that was tested in those standard evaluations given to parties. So what did we find? Well, we hypothesized that early caucus would do 3 things. It would foster a sense of control in the parties, it would set a calm tone, and it would build trust and rapport. And we hypothesized that all 3 of these things are things that would reduce stress. So we didn't measure stress directly, but we used these 3 components as a proxy for how much stress the parties were under. And what we found in the comments after the session was that both the mediators and the parties felt that early caucus actually did help produce a calm tone, give parties more control, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the third one, but foster a sense of control, set a calm tone, and build trust and rapport. So those, we did find that those things were all present, and both the mediators and the parties mentioned that. We also found, when we looked at the questionnaires of the early caucus mediations and compared them with the earlier group done without early caucus, that parties felt they understood the process more with early caucus, and we found that the parties felt more understood by the mediator in early caucus. This was so successful, and it was so well received by the CCR mediators that now it is the way all long-form mediations are done at CCR. And that's something that hasn't changed at CCR in a millennia.
Did it turn out that the mediator repeated the same introductory remarks in the joint session that they had already covered?
Yes, not the mediators didn't do an opening statement in the early caucus, but they were giving people information that normally the mediator would cover and did cover in their opening statement. And that was one of the things that was so interesting, was that when people were asked at the end of the session, what were the benefits of early caucus? They said, I found out what the process would be. These were people who were told by the staff when they called in what the process was, and were told by the mediator at the beginning of joint session what the process was. And the parties looked back to that early caucus. So it seemed to be the sweet spot where you could actually get through to people. It wasn't so far before the mediation that people weren't paying attention. And it wasn't at this very high stress point in the mediation when you're first all sitting down. So the benefits for the party, gave them an opportunity to meet the mediator. So this unknown, get comfortable with their surroundings, get comfortable with who the mediator is. Mediator maybe used some small talk. How are you? How did you get here? That sort of thing. It gave them the opportunity, as we just talked about, to ask questions about process and hear the answer in a way that doesn't seem to be the same once you get into joint session. It was an opportunity to see whether or not there were high emotions and acknowledge them. Parties got to see the mediator as a resource and an ally. So remember that first slide with the cortisol, there were two different curves depending on what kind of resources you had. And by thinking the mediator would be an ally and a resource, as opposed to an unknown person that you've never met before, gives you a little bit of a leg up in reducing that cortisol response. Overall, the parties felt more in control because they understood better what was going on. Not only did stress reduce, at least we believe that stress was reduced by using this early caucus, there were clearly benefits to the mediator. It gave the mediators an opportunity to build trust and rapport, to set a calm tone. You know, sometimes you get into joint session and maybe there's an attorney who talks a mile a minute or something else that gets everybody all revved up. This lets you start out in a calm, nice situation where everybody can kind of ease into the process. Yeah.
Are most of these mediations with attorneys, the parties had an attorney?
The ones we did at CCR were mostly without attorneys. There was only one or two in the test group that there were attorneys.
So then with the ones without attorneys, do the parties maybe in an early caucus kind of, do you think that they feel more comfortable? I mean, do you think that they have a false hope or understanding that a mediator is probably like their adversary or maybe on their side? You don't think you could kind of...
We didn't find any negative consequences. One of the things we looked for in this study was whether there would be a perception of bias. and there wasn't. There was absolutely nothing to indicate that. In fact, to the degree we saw anything with respect to fairness, it was that people seemed to feel it was more fair with early caucus. It wasn't really a significant difference, but that's the direction that went. It also gives the mediator an opportunity to prepare for joint session so that you're not going into it blind, not knowing whether there's some person who is about to explode or whatever. You have a little bit of a handle on that. So after we did that study, the task force from the ABA section on dispute resolution came out. This was a meta-study that looked at all sorts of different studies of techniques used by mediators. And they weren't able to come to a lot of firm conclusions, but one conclusion they were able to draw from all of these other studies is that if there was a pre-mediation caucus, essentially our early caucus, that was used to build trust, which ours was. Currently, some people use it to try and convince the parties to settle or something. But when it was used to build trust, they found an increase in settlement and a reduction in post-dispute conflict. So they found that this was a valuable technique. So a short, informal caucus with each side, it benefits the parties in reduced stress, and it benefits the mediators in increased knowledge. So that's number one. Number two, acknowledging stress. So when we learn facilitative mediation, we learn you have to acknowledge emotions, right? You have to say, gee, it looks like you're angry, something like that. It turns out that when we look at the science, that's not the best way to acknowledge emotions. Sorry, that's not where I'm at. In addition to acknowledging emotions, we should be acknowledging stress. Just as we say specifically acknowledging how people are feeling, we also can say, you know, I know this is a stressful situation. A lot of people find it to be stressful, and there's some things, simple things you can do. You just take a few deep breaths. You can ask for a break, so we can all, take a break, go for a cup of coffee, do something like that. And also, as we'll see at the end, journaling can be very useful for somebody who's feeling high stress.
So is it the stress of not knowing the process that makes the stress level go up? And then towards the end, the feeling at ease?
Well, it's all of these different things that makes the stress level go up. It's not knowing what's going to be happening. It's not knowing the mediator. It's not feeling comfortable in the room. It's being fearful of what's going to happen. All of those things trigger the stress response. And so it is a stressful situation for a party. And to acknowledge that and just say, you know, I know this is going to be stressful for you can be useful. It can help lower stress just to acknowledge that it exists.
I have a question on journaling as well. So are you journaling during the mediation? Are you taking notes? Is that what you do?
So I'm going to talk about journaling separately.
Perfect.
So, well, I'll get to that. Okay, so now this is where I was going before, sorry. Name the emotion. So we're told you should name the emotion, you should acknowledge emotion. But it turns out when we look at the science, naming the emotion isn't always the best way to accomplish reducing that emotion by acknowledging it. So this is a study by Lieberman where he used an fMRI machine, a functional MRI machine, where the subject is put in, asked to do a task while they take pictures of the brain. And this was about putting emotions into words. So the people get shoved into this big machine, and they're given one of 3 different tasks, and they're tested with different tasks at different times. The first one is called affect labeling. They're shown a picture of an emotional face, and they're asked to push a button on left or right to match it with the word to describe that face. The second situation is they're shown an emotional face, and they're asked to match a different face with the same emotion. In the third situation, they're just shown this emotional face and they don't do anything. While this is going on, they're taking MRIs of the brain and looking for activation in the amygdala, these two little almond-shaped things that do lots of stuff, including control emotion. And when they measure the amount of amygdala activity, the highest is when people just look at these emotional faces, and that's it. When they try and match a secondary face with the same emotion, there's a somewhat, but not significant decrease in amygdala activity. But when they choose the word, when they label it, there is a very significant decrease in amygdala activity, indicating that it's bringing the emotional level down. There was also this incredibly
What
cool.
would be an example in the session?
So I'll get to that, but it's instead of saying you look angry, saying how are you feeling right now, so that the person labels it rather than you labeling it for them. So it's a very subtle difference.
So don't name it.
Don't name the emotion, ask the person to name their own emotion so that they label it. You know, when you say you look angry and they say, no, I'm not angry, I'm, you know, disappointed, you get there too. But so then there is the secondary study that I found that is just incredibly cool. It is affect labeling in the age of Twitter. These guys looked at over 1 billion tweets. Obviously, some algorithm looked at 1 billion tweets. And they looked for specific tweets that said something like, I feel great or I feel awful. It was a very narrow band of things that they were looking for. They found 42,000 tweets that expressed positive emotion. I feel great. They found 67,000 tweets that that were expressing negative emotions. Then they looked at the tweets by those tens of thousands of people for 6 hours before and after those tweets. And they measured the valence of all their tweets. Now, the valence is how positive or negative the tweet or the expression is. And so if we look at the blue graph, which is the positive emotions, we see in the middle is where they said, I feel great. So that has a very high positive valence. They found that the tweets before and after were up and down, but it was fairly symmetric. So saying I feel great didn't really have a major impact. But when they looked at the negative emotions, they found that in the hour or two before that negative tweet, that I feel awful, things were getting more and more negative. And as soon as they said, I feel terrible, it went back up immediately. This was particularly true of women. So this is another situation where labeling your emotion changes it, particularly those negative emotions. So instead of saying, it sounds like you're feeling angry, say, what emotion are you feeling now? And it's just a very small tweak, but it might actually make the acknowledgement of emotions more effective. Okay, we're on to our fourth strategy, which is about venting. So we often, I certainly was taught when I first learned mediation that you need the cathartic event of getting it off your chest. You know, you should let people really vent and they'll feel better and you'll be able to get further. In fact, venting anger increases negative emotions. Negative emotions, as we've seen, are stressors, and therefore that stress is going to have a negative impact on your mediation. So this was the coolest study by Bushman. Does anger feed or extinguish the flame? Bushman's done a number of different studies looking at what happens when we vent anger. In this one, the subject, naturally a college student, was asked to write an essay about abortion. And they were told that there was a counterpart that they were working with who was also going to write an essay, but there really wasn't a counterpart. And then they were told to switch essays with their counterpart, and they were given some essay. And then they were asked to write a critique. And so they wrote a critique of the other person's essay. And then they got the critique of their own essay back, and it ripped apart what they had written. Just was the nastiest kind of thing you can imagine. So what does that do? It produces anger. You get mad when people do that to you, right? So they induce anger. Then these people who are now very angry are told to do one of three things. Either sit quietly for 2 minutes, punch a punching bag for 2 minutes while looking at a picture of their supposed partner, or punch a punching bag for exercise. So for 2 minutes, they either sat quietly, they vented, or they punched for exercise. Then they measured their emotions. And they found with respect to positive emotions, it didn't really matter. Whatever they did, they stayed about the same. But when they looked at negative emotions, they found that the people who just sat quietly had the lowest level of anger, whereas the people who punched to vent had the highest. So the idea of venting to get it off your chest, in this case, was increasing the anger. But then they took it another step, and they decided to test what their level of aggression was. And the way they did that is they said, okay, sit down and we're going to have a little contest. We're going to test your reaction time versus your opponent. And when you win, you get to punish your opponent with a very loud noise. And you can control how loud it is and how long it stays on. And what do you think they found? The people who sat were the least aggressive. The people who punched for exercise had a medium amount, and the people who were venting, they were aggressive. They pushed that button for a long time and gave them a big dose of noise. So venting anger, and that's what they're measuring in this study and others that Bushman has done, definitely feeds the flame and triggers the stress response. Now, I've given this talk in a variety of different ways. I'm a venting talk in a variety of different ways. And what I normally get asked about is, what if it's not anger? And I don't have a real answer to that. I don't think it's the same. I think people who are venting sadness or venting disappointment, it's a different set of circumstances, and it doesn't create the same problems, but certainly venting anger does. And by and large, when you're going into mediation, anger is the most common emotion I think that we see. Now, sometimes parties are going to vent no matter what you do, right? They just come in there and they want to get it all out. They want to tell their story. They want to punish that other guy. So in a situation when there is going to be venting, no matter what you do, it's better to do it early, and it's better to do it in caucus. If you do it early, there'll be time for that cortisol level to come down before you get to the point in the mediation where you're trying to resolve things. And in caucus, at least you won't piss off the other side. Now, back in the 90s, when William Ury wrote Getting Past No, he talked about going to the balcony. And it turns out that there are studies that show that asking people to recount things in the third person can help reduce the amount of stress that is, the amount of emotion. And so instead of saying, well, tell me what happened, you can say, pretend you were watching it on a stage. What would a person watching what happened, what would they have seen? Or another thing you can do is ask, why do you think you had such a strong emotional reaction? So bringing it a little away from that first person, how I felt, what I did, what was happening to me, and bringing it into a third party kind of situation can lessen the impact. On the other hand, there are benefits for venting. Very often, people will come in with positions that don't really reflect entirely their emotional interests. And venting often is an entree for the mediator to try and figure out what those emotional interests may be, so that, you know, you don't really want to shoot the neighbor's dog. What you really want is some peace and quiet, and maybe after having the venting occur, you might be able to tease that out a little bit. Another thing that venting can do is offer procedural justice. I did many foreclosure mediations, and in many of those, the borrowers really got nowhere with the banks. But on a number of occasions, borrowers would come up and hug me at the end of the mediation, even though they didn't get any relief from the bank, because they were treated with respect. They were given an opportunity to tell their story. So I don't want to imply here that there is nothing beneficial from venting, but overall, I think it is wise to understand that it is not a release valve, that venting anger is detrimental to the process, and you need to balance it. You certainly don't want to encourage venting anger. Okay, my fifth strategy has to do with recovery time. This is the graph I showed you earlier about cortisol. And remember, it takes an hour for those cortisol levels to come down. So what can you do to make sure that people are not getting to the part of the mediation where they're trying to make decisions when they are flooded with cortisol? You can build in recovery time, caucus with the other party and give people that chance to just sit, you know, or take breaks. Tell everybody to walk around the block. Tell everybody, you know, go to lunch. Or you can use journaling, as I'll talk about in just a few minutes. But building in that recovery time when there's a particularly emotional mediation can be very helpful. My sixth strategy is summarizing. We saw that high levels of cortisol can impact memory, and summarizing can counteract some of these faulty memories. So it can help people interpret levels of anger. If you're summarizing what you're seeing in front of you, you can summarize, well, you know, your opponent just was very conciliatory or something like that, to bring a little dose of reality in if they are over projecting the anger. It also can be useful to counteract recall errors. So at the end of the mediation, they may misremember what was said at the beginning, and you're summarizing over again what happened earlier can counteract those memory failures. And finally, I'll get to journaling. Journaling is expressive writing. It's writing down personal thoughts, experiences, feelings, or reflections for private use. It has got no regard for grammar, punctuation, or spelling. It doesn't need to be objectively correct. And it does not need to be some habitual practice that you do for months at a time. This has been studied extensively by psychologists, starting with many studies by Pennebaker, but also many others have looked at it. And what Pennebaker did is ask students to write about a traumatic event. And they were told to spend 15 minutes 2 to 4 times writing about a traumatic event. And the people who did that just 2 times had a decreased use of mental and physical health services in the coming months. So it's been well documented that journaling can improve mental and physical health.
Can you explain that 2 to 4 times 15 minutes?
So what the studies did is asked people to write about something 2, 3, or 4 times, days in a row.
Different days.
Yes,
Separate.
sorry. Yes, days in a row.
How about the same experience?
Yes.
And I think there was some time had to have elapsed from the time of the traumatic event. You wouldn't do this.
That day, yeah. So Pennebaker did many different studies. There are all kinds of studies that looked at this in different ways. But the takeaway overall is that writing about something just a few times, just a few days in a row, or perhaps even once, increased your mental and physical health. And this is consistent with the neuroscience that we saw with the affect labeling. This is another form of doing that affect labeling, of talking about your own emotions and writing down what they are. And that we saw decreased amygdala activity.
So in the context of mediation, where when these
Well, just so happens. I think you can use it 2 different ways. One is you can use it if you have the opportunity before the mediation to suggest that people use journaling to describe an incident that precipitated the conflict, or reflections on their own emotional response to the conflict, or ideas for resolving emotional issues. So you can suggest to the parties that they do this before the mediation. Excuse me. In a lot of cases, we're in situations where we don't have that opportunity, but you could still use it during a mediation by saying, I'm going to go caucus with the other side. While I'm doing that, here's a pencil and paper. Write down a description of your current emotional state. Write down a description of the emotions you had in the past with respect to the incident that brought you here today. Or write down some options for how you think the emotional component here could be resolved. The most important thing about this is that it be confidential, that it be clear to people that this is only for their own use. This is not something to be shared. Obviously, if they want to share it, they can, but that nobody is going to be reading it. The mediator isn't going to be reading it. It's just for them. You don't buy this. What don't you buy?
Well, it doesn't come within the definition of a mediation. If you're writing stuff to yourself,
Yeah.
your own person, people's diaries are often subpoenaed. There's no privilege. So I think there's a risk there. How would you respond to that?
Well, it is a writing that would be prepared in connection with mediation.
Is it
I don't see.
communication? It's just for you.
I think you could make that argument.
Yeah.
I
Argue it. Anyway,
I don't.
I'm always thinking the worst case.
Yeah, I guess, you know, if you have, I think in the emotional context, I'd be hard pressed to figure out how that's going to really come back to bite you. You know, it's not like you're asking them to come up with settlement numbers on their own and not share them or something like that. You're asking them to think about their own emotional state, either during the mediation or prior to the mediation. So,
And I'm not denying that.
yeah.
I'm just wondering if it's really secure. Really safe, not to worry. I would say this.
Yeah, so I mean, personally, I think I've done it, but I've just asked them to destroy it or just,
Yeah.
it gets destroyed, you know. It
Right.
gets-
If you destroy it on the spot,
Yeah, yeah, don't even take it home.
Don't take it home. Don't keep it.
My background is in mental health, so what comes to my mind is I do explain my credentials to my participants, my clients, and I distinguish between the difference between therapy and mediation with them.
yes.
So when I start saying write down your feelings, to me that's crossing the boundary. That's more therapeutic, which isn't therapy, but I don't get the benefit. But do you have any suggestions on wording that would not?
Well, I think the fact that as a mediator, I'm not going to read it. I mean, I'm not going to use it in a therapeutic way. I'm certainly not a trained therapist, but as I could ask someone to spend some time doing that, it might help them clarify their own thoughts, which is, you know, if I have no interaction with it, then I don't see how it rises to therapy. This is the okay.
I think you don't want your client's thoughts to come up in a custody case, for example. To show, you know, how emotionally unstable they are. You know, at the same time as they're going to therapy, and therapists have personal notes, hopefully
Are protected.
over, and then all of that should be protected by statutes and
Right,
but
right.
As a lawyer, you have to warn them about their choices.
Yeah, so I think maybe the best thing to do would be, if you use this technique, to tell them to rip it up.
To them, it's like everything else. It may be so much help. They'll help for them not to rip it up.
Yeah.
Another question. So the mediation process is confidential, and so even if they are taking notes in the mediation process, should that still be considered?
Well, I think what we're saying is that if it's not, mediation communications are confidential, but if it's only for your own use, for the party's own use, is it a communication?
You can put something in the agreement to mediate. Cover it.
Yeah.
I'd rather rely on a statute than
All right. So I have suggested 7 strategies to reduce stress. The use of early caucus, acknowledging stress specifically, naming the emotion and getting the party to name their own emotion, minimizing venting, particularly venting anger, providing recovery time within the process, using summarizing to minimize errors in perception of anger or in memory, and journaling. So, should we try the quiz again? Although you guys were pretty right on the first time. But let's see. True or false? There, you need the true or false part. You should start your mediation and during session. All reds, yes. I think that's false. You should start your mediation in early caucus. True or false? Reduce high emotions by naming them. Red, that's false. Let the parties name their own emotions. Venting anger helps in mediation. False. Venting anger can be detrimental. And so that's false. And finally, journaling can be useful in mediation. And there we go. It's all green. It's true that it can be a useful tool. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any other questions you may have.
So when you're talking to people about, well, how much do you talk to them about what you're doing and encouraging these techniques?
I don't. I mean, early caucus, I just do it. I don't say, okay, I'm now going to talk to you so that I reduce your stress level or something like that. Although I will say in an early caucus, this might be very stressful. And, you know, maybe let's think about things you could do to reduce that.
Do you ask how are you feeling in a caucus or in a session?
So in the early caucus, I will generally say something like, how are you feeling right now? Or, you know, what are you feeling about how this is going to go? Or what are your expectations? I'll ask some kind of question like that. It's usually pretty apparent when people come in bursting with anger. It's usually hard to miss. And those are the people you want to spend a little extra time with, trying to deal with that a little bit. Or at least maybe a few minutes on your own, trying to figure out how you'll deal with it when they all get together and it gets worse.
Would you ask it in the session how are you feeling? Would that make the person feel more vulnerable?
I think it depends. I think that there are situations where you might do that. With this whole venting thing, I had asked a number of mediators to give me situations in which there was venting and tell me what happened. And Cookie Levitz gave me an example. And Cookie said what happened was that there was the husband was just going on and on at a very high volume, so high volume that people were coming from down the hall to see if everything was all right. And the wife was not really perturbed at all by this. And it turned out that he wasn't venting anger. He was venting sadness and loss. And he was so upset that, you know, this marriage was breaking up and you know, he was not going to be with his kids, whatever it was. Which got me to really step back and think about different kinds of venting. So in that kind of situation, Cookie said that this went on for some time and the wife never reacted to it. And ultimately, by the end, they were hugging.
You know, it could be useful for the benefit of one of the parties, because most of the mediations that I'm involved in are employment-related matters. And oftentimes you'll have a more sophisticated church representative and corporate client, but the plaintiff wants to get their story out.
Yes.
And they want the other people to hear what they have to say.
Yes.
Which I think puts the plaintiff, I mean, that is satisfying your need right there for the plaintiff to be able to say, you're hearing me, which I think can help them to be more open to be.
But perhaps there's a way to get some of the highly emotional component of that out in caucus and control what they're going to say in joint session, so that they have that opportunity to tell their story, but without it being something that triggers that defensive mechanism that will happen if they start, you know, name calling and that sort of thing. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. I just want to remind everybody again for the sign up if you're interested in maybe judging the competition here in March.
And if you guys can fill out evaluations, we need them for credit also. So if you're
So there are only
doing
two
CLE credit.
people,
Who owe you a lot, because you went through a lot to do Zoom for them.
Thank you so much
That was
again.
heroic.
you're very
On
welcome.
behalf of ACR, thank you for doing this for us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you so much for allowing us to come here again, and
You're welcome.
you are a good partner.
Switch rooms, every kind of technology.
I land late, so.
Technology portion.
And Brian, you have something to say about the event in March?
So I've been working with Christina. So my name is Brian Range. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Iowa. I'm from Chicago and I'm relocating my practice back to this area. So I've been working, my background, I have several certifications in trauma-informed care. So we're supposed to be putting on a workshop on trauma-informed care.
How do you get on the, how do we get on the United?